The Dance of the Changer and the Three by Terry Carr. Quite unusually, this story first appeared in multiple anthologies and only later showed up in a few magazines. The first anthology was The Farthest Reaches in 1968. The next year, when nominated for the Nebula Award and taking third place for the Hugo Award, it appeared in three more: a French one, then World's Best Science Fiction, 1969, followed by Nebula Award Stories Four. Yet more such appearances have continued ever since. The first publication it had in a magazine was in the April 1973 issue of Vertex. Its first inclusion in a collection of the author's stories was in The Light at the End of the Universe in 1976. I must briefly introduce this story by quoting someone named Chris from a website called Young People Read Old SSF, which will be linked below. Quote, "What it manages to do successfully is what so many other authors try and fail at, creating another species with a completely alien mode of thought. And it explains it in a way that is so clever, we are told a story about a story. As such, it can take multiple reads to unpack, but to do so is quite rewarding. The Loara, as an energy-based life form, simply do not conceive of the universe in the way we carbon-based life forms do. As our narrator says, I was ambassador to a planet full of things that would tell me with a straight face that 2 and 2 are orange. Now, to us, that may be nonsensical. However, if you consider it as points on the electromagnetic spectrum, the increased frequency would move to orange, whilst the suggestion that it would merely make twice as much red light would be absurd. And this is where we get to the heart of the conflict." End quote. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. The Dance of the Changer and the Three. This all happened ages ago, out in the depths of space beyond Dark Edge, where galaxies lumber ponderously through the black like silent, bright rhinoceroses. It was so long ago that when the light from Loar's galaxy finally reached Earth, after millions of light years, there was no one here to see it, except a few things in the oceans which were too mindlessly busy with their monotonous single-celled reactions to notice. Yet, as long ago as it was, the present-day Loara still remember this story and retell it in complex, shifting wave dances every time one of the newly changed asks for it. The wave dances wouldn't mean much to you if you saw them, nor, I suppose, would the story itself if I were to tell it just as it happened. So consider this a translation, and don't bother yourself that when I say water, I don't mean our hydrogen-oxygen compound, nor that there's no sky as such on Loar, nor, for that matter, that the Loara aren't creatures that think or feel in quite the way we understand. In fact, you could take this as a piece of pure fiction, because there are damned few real facts in it. But I know better, or worse, because I know how true it is. And that has a lot to do with why I'm back here on Earth, with 42 friends and co-workers left dead on Loar. They never had a chance. There was a changer who had spent 3 life cycles planning a particular cycle climax and who had come to the moment of action. He wasn't really named Miniaro, but I'll call him that because it's the closest thing I can write down to approximate the tone, emotional matrix, and associations that were all wrapped up in his designation. When he came to his decision, he turned away from the crag on which he'd been standing, overlooking the Loaran Ocean, and went quickly to the personality homes of 3 of his best friends. To the first friend, Asteria, he said, I'm going to commit suicide. Wave dancing this message in his best festive tone. His friend laughed, as Miniaro had hoped, but only for a short time. Then he turned away and left Miniaro alone, because there had already been several suicides lately, and it was wearing a little thin. To his second friend, Miniaro gave a pledge salute, going through all 60 sequences with exaggerated care, and wave danced, "Tomorrow I shall immerse my body in the ocean if anyone will watch." His second friend, Fless, smiled tolerantly and told him he would come and see the performance. To his third friend, with many excited leapings and boundings, Miniaro described what he imagined would happen to him after he had gone under the lapping waters of the ocean. The dance he went through to give this description was intricate and even imaginative, because Miniaro had spent most of that third life cycle working it out in his mind. It used motion and color and sound and another sense, something like smell, all to communicate descriptions of falling, impact with the water, and then the quick dissolution and blending in the currents of the ocean, the dimming and loss of awareness, then darkness, and finally the awakening, the completion of the change. Miniaro had a rather romantic turn of mind, so he imagined himself recoalescing around the life moat of one of Loire's greatest heroes, Krolim, and forming on Krolim's old pattern, and he even ended the dance with suggestions of glory and imitation of himself by others, which was definitely presumptuous. But the friend for whom the dance was given did nod approvingly at several points. "If it turns out to be half what you anticipate," said this friend, Purr, "then I envy you, but you never know." "I guess not," Miniaro said, rather morosely, and he hesitated before leaving, for Purr was what I suppose I'd better call female, and Miniaro had rather hoped that she would join him in the ocean jump. But if she thought of it, she gave no sign, merely gazing at Miniaro calmly, waiting for him to go, so finally he did. At the appropriate time, with his friend Fless watching him from the edge of the cliff, Miniaro did his final wave dance as Miniaro, a rather excited, ill-coordinated thing in places, but that was understandable in the circumstances, and then performed his approach to the edge, leaped and tumbled downward through the air, making fully 24 turns this way and that before he hit the water. Fless hurried back and described the suicide to Asteria and Purr, who laughed and applauded in most of the right places, so on the whole it was a success. Then the three of them sat down and began plotting Miniaro's revenge. All right, I know a lot of this doesn't make sense. Maybe that's because I'm trying to tell you about the Loire in human terms, which is a mistake with creatures so alien as they are. Actually, the Loire are almost wholly an energy life form, their consciousnesses coalescing in each life cycle around a spatial center, which they call a life moat, so that if you could see the patterns of energy they form, as I have, using a sense filter our expedition developed for that purpose, they'd look rather like a spiral nebula sometimes, or other times like iron filings gathering around a magnet, or maybe like a half-melted snowflake. That's probably what Miniaro looked like on that day, because it's the suicides and the aged who look like that. Their forms keep shifting, of course, but each individual usually keeps close to one pattern. Loire itself is a gigantic gaseous planet, with an orbit so close to its primary that its year is only about 37 Earth standard days long. In Earth system, the orbit would be considerably inside that of Venus. There's a solid core to the planet, and a lot of hard outcroppings like islands, but most of the surface is in a molten or gaseous state, swirling and bubbling and howling with winds and storms, It's not a very inviting planet if you're anything like a human being, but it does have one thing which brought it to Unicentral's attention: mining. Do you have any idea what mining is like on a planet where most metals are fluid from the heat and/or pressure? Most people haven't heard much about this because it isn't a situation we encounter often, but it was there on Loire, and it was very, very interesting, because our analyses showed some elements that had been, until then, only computer theory elements, which were supposed to exist only in the hearts of suns, for one thing, and if we could get hold of some of them, well, you see what I mean. The mining possibilities were very interesting indeed. Of course, it would take half the wealth of Earth system to outfit a full-scale expedition there, but Unicentral hummed for 2.8 seconds and then issued detailed instructions on just how it was all to be arranged. So there we went. And there I was, a standard year later, 5 standard years ago, sitting inside a mountain of artificial earth welded onto one of Loire's islands, and wondering what the hell I was doing there, because I'm not a mining engineer, not a physicist or comp technician, nor, in fact, much of anything that requires technical training. I'm a glorified salesman, otherwise called a public relations man, and there was just no reason for me to have been assigned to such a hellish, impossible, God-forsaken, inconceivable, and plain damned unlivable planet as Loire. But there was a reason, and it was the Loire, of course. They lived, quote-unquote lived, there, and they were intelligent, so we had to negotiate with them. Ergo, me. So, in the next several years, while I negotiated and we set up operations and I acted as go-between, I learned a lot about them. Just enough to translate, however clumsily, the wave dance of the Changer and the Three, which is their equivalent of a classic folk hero myth, or would be if they had anything honestly equivalent to anything of ours. To continue. Fless was in favor of building a pact between the three by which they would, each in turn and each with deliberate lack of the appropriate salutes, commit suicide in exactly the same way Miniaro had. Thus, we can kill this suicide, Fless explained in excited waves through the air, but Purr was more practical. Thus, she corrected him, we would kill only this suicide. It is unimaginative, a thing to be done by rote, and Miniaro deserves more. Asteria seemed undecided. He hopped about, sparking and disappearing and reappearing inches away in another color. They waited for him to comment, and finally he stabilized, stood still in the air, settled to the ground, and held himself firmly there. Then he said in slow, careful movements, I'm not sure he deserves an original revenge. It wasn't a new suicide, after all, and who is to avenge us? A single spark leaped from him. Who is to avenge us? He repeated, this time with more pronounced motions. Perhaps, said Purr slowly, we will need no revenge if our act is great enough. The other two paused in their random wave motions, considering this. Fless shifted from blue to green to a bright red, which dimmed to yellow. Asteria pulsated a deep ultraviolet. Everyone has always been avenged, Fless said at last. What you suggest is meaningless. But if we do something great enough, Purr said, and now she began to radiate heat which drew the other two reluctantly toward her. Something which has never been done before in any form, something for which there can be no revenge, for it will be a positive thing, not a death change, not a destruction or a disappearance or a forgetting. even a great one, a positive thing. Asteria's ultraviolet grew darker, darker, until he seemed to be nothing more than a hole in the air. Dangerous, 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 he droned, moving torpidly back and forth. You know it's impossible to ask. We'd have to give up all our life cycles to come because a positive in the world. He blinked into darkness and did not reappear for long seconds. When he did, he was perfectly still, pulsating weakly, but gradually regaining strength. Purr waited till his color and tone showed consciousness had returned, then moved in a light wave motion calculated to draw the other two back into calm, reasonable discourse. I've thought about this for 6 life cycles already. She danced. I must be right. No one has worked on a problem for so long. A positive would not be dangerous, no matter what the 3 and 4 cycle theories say. It would be beneficial. She paused, hanging orange in midair. And it would be new, she said with a quick spiral. Oh, how new! And so, at length, they agreed to follow her plan, and it was briefly this. On a far outcropping set in the deepest part of the Loiran Ocean, where crashing, tearing storms whipped molten metal compounds into blinding spray, there was a vortex of forces which was avoided by every Loara on pain of instant and final death change. The most ancient wave dances of that ancient time said that the vortex had always been there, that the Loara themselves had been born there, or had escaped from there, or had in some way cheated the laws that ruled there. Whatever the truth about that was, the vortex was an eater of energy, calling and catching from afar any Loara or other beings who strayed within its influence. For all the life on Loar is energy-based, even the mindless, drifting food beasts, creatures of uniform dull color, no internal motion, no scent or tone, and absolutely no self-volition. Their place in the Loaran scheme of things is and was literally nothing more than that of food. So even though there were countless food beasts drifting in the air in most areas of the planet, the Loara hardly ever noticed them. They ate them when they were hungry and looked around them at any other time. Then you want us to destroy the vortex? Cried Fles, dancing and dodging to right and left in agitation. Not destroy, Purr said calmly. It will be a life change, not a destruction. Life change? Said Asteria faintly, wavering in the air, and she said it again. Life change. For the vortex had once created, or somehow allowed to be created, the oldest of the Loara, those many cycles ago beings who had combined and split, reacted and changed countless times to become the Loara of this day. And if creation could happen at the vortex once, then it could happen again. But how? Asked Fles, trying now to be reasonable, dancing the question with precision and holding a steady green color as he did so. We will need help, Purr said, and went on to explain that she had heard from a wind bird, a creature with little intelligence but perfect memory, that there was one of the oldest still living his first life cycle in a personality home somewhere near the vortex, in that most ancient time of the race when suicide had been considered extreme as a means of cycle change. This oldest had made his change by a sort of negative suicide. He had frozen his cycle so that his consciousness and form continued in a never-ending repetition of themselves on and on, while his friends changed and grew and learned as they ran through life cycle after life cycle, becoming different people with common memories, moving forward into the future by this method, while he, the last oldest, remained fixed at the beginning. He saw only the beginning, remembered only the beginning, understood only the beginning. And for that reason, his had been the most tragic of all Luaran changes, and the Windbird had heard it rumored in 8 different ways, each of which it repeated word for word to Purr, that in the ages since that change, more than 100 Luara had attempted revenge for the oldest, but always without success. And it had never been repeated, so that this oldest was the only oldest, and for that reason he was important to their quest, Purr explained. With a perplexed growing and shrinking, brightening and dimming, Asteria asked, "But how can he live anywhere near the vortex and not be consumed by it?" "That is a crucial part of what we must find out," Purr said, and after the proper salutes and rituals, the 3 set out to find the oldest. The wave dance of the Changer and the 3 traditionally at this point spends a great deal of time in great splashes of color and bursts of light and subtly contrived clouds of darkness, all interplaying with hops and swoops and blinking and dodging back and forth to describe the scene as Purr, Fles, and Asteria set off across that ancient molten sea. I've seen the dance countless times, and each viewing has seemed to bring me maddeningly closer to understanding the meaning which this has for the Luara themselves. Lowering clouds, flashing bursts of aimless, lifeless energy, a rumbling sea below, whose swirling depths pulled and tugged at the 3 as they swept overhead, darting around each other in complex patterns like electrons, playing cat's cradle around an invisible nucleus. A droning of lamentation from the Changers left behind on their rugged home island, and giggles from those who had recently changed, and the colors of the 3 themselves, burning red Asteria, and glowing green Fles, and steady, golden Purr. I see and hear them all, but I feel only a weird kind of alien beauty, not the grandeur, excitement, and awesomeness which they have for the Luara. When the 3 felt the vibrations and swirlings in the air that told them they were coming near to the vortex, they paused in their flight and hung in an interpatterned motion sequence above the dark, rolling sea, conversing only in short flickerings of color because they had to hold the pattern tightly in order to withstand the already strong attraction of the vortex. "Somewhere near?" asked Asteria, pulsing a quick green. "Closer to the vortex, I think," Purr said, chancing a sequence of reds and violets. "Can we be sure?" asked Fles, but there was no answer from Purr, and he had expected none from Asteria. The ocean crashed and leaped, the air howled around them, and the vortex pulled at them. Suddenly they felt their motion sequence changing against their wills, and for long moments all 3 were afraid that it was the vortex's attraction that was doing it. They moved in closer to each other and whirled more quickly in a still more intricate pattern, but it did no good. Irresistibly they were drawn apart again, and at the same time the 3 of them were moved toward the vortex. And then they felt the oldest among them. He had joined the motion sequence, and this must have been why they had felt the sequence changed and loosened, to make room for him. Whirling and blinking, the oldest led them inward over the frightening sea, radiating warmth through the storm, and as they followed, or were pulled along, they studied him in wonder. He was hardly recognizable as one of them, this ancient oldest. He was not quite energy any longer. He was half matter, carrying the strange mass with awkward, aged grace. his outer edges almost rigid as they held the burden of his congealed center and carried it through the air. Looking rather like a half-dissolved snowflake, yes, only dark and dismal, a snowflake weighted with coal dust. And, for now at least, he was completely silent. Only when he had brought the three safely into the calm of his barren personality home on a tiny rock jutting at an angle from the wash of the sea did he speak. There, inside a cone of quiet against which the ocean raged and fell back, the winds faltered and even the vortex's power was nullified, the oldest said wearily, "So, you have come." He spoke with a slow waving back and forth, augmented by only a dull red color. To this, the three did not know what to say, but Purr finally hazarded, "Have you been waiting for us?" The oldest pulsed a somewhat brighter red, once, twice. He paused. Then he said, "I do not wait. There is nothing to wait for." Again the pulse of brighter red. "One waits for the future, but there is no future, you know." "Not for him," Purr said softly to her companions, and Fles and Asteria sank, wavering, to the stone floor of the oldest's home, where they rocked back and forth. The oldest sank with them, and when he touched down he remained motionless. Purr drifted over the others, maintaining movement, but unable to raise her color above a steady blue-green. She said to the oldest, "But you knew we would come." "Would come? Would come? Yes, and did come, and have come, and are come. It is today only, you know, for me. I will be the oldest when the others pass me by. I will never change, nor will my world." "But the others have already passed you by," Fles said. "We are many life cycles after you, oldest. So many it is beyond the count of wind birds." The oldest seemed to draw his material self into a more upright posture, forming his energy flow carefully around it. To the red of his color he added a low hum with only the slightest quaver as he said, "Nothing is after me here on rock. When you come here, you come out of time, just as I have. So now you have always been here and will always be here, for as long as you are here." Asteria sparked yellow suddenly and danced upward into the becalmed air. As Fles stared and Purr moved quickly after him to calm him, he drove himself again and again at the edge of the cone of quiet that was the oldest's refuge. Each time was thrown back, and each time returned to dash himself once more against the edge of the storm, trying to penetrate back into it. He flashed and burned countless colors, and strange sound frequencies filled the quiet, until at last, with Purr's stern direction and Fles's blank gaze upon him, he sank back wearily to the stone floor. "A trap! A trap!" he pulsed. "This is it. This is the vortex itself. We should have known, and will never get away." The oldest had paid no attention to Asteria's display. He said slowly, "And it is because I am not in time that the vortex cannot touch me, and it is because I am out of time that I know what the vortex is, for I can remember myself born in it." Purr left Asteria then and came close to the oldest. She hung above him, thinking with blue vibrations, then asked, Can you tell us how you were born? What is creation? How new things are made?" She paused a moment and added, "And what is the vortex?" The oldest seemed to lean forward, seemed tired. His color had deepened again to the darkest red, and the three could clearly see every atom of matter within his energy field, stark and hard. He said, "So many questions to ask one question." And he told them the answer. And I can't tell you that answer because I don't know it. No one knows it now, not even the present-day Luara, who are the three after 1,000 million billion life cycles, because the Luara really do become different persons when they pass from one cycle to another, and after that, many changes. Memory becomes meaningless. "Try it sometime," one of the Luara once wave-danced to me, and there was no indication that he thought this was a joke. Today, for instance, the three themselves, 1,000 million billion times removed from themselves, but still, they maintain themselves, often come to watch the dance of the changer and the three, and even though it is about them, they are still excited and moved by it, as though it were a tale never even heard before, let alone lived through. Yet, let a dancer miss a movement or color or sound by even the slightest nuance, and the three will correct him. And yes, many times the legended changer himself, Miniaro, he who started the story, has attended these dances, though often he leaves after the recreation of his suicide dance. It's sometimes difficult to tell one given Luara from all the others. By the way, despite the complex and subtle technologies of Unicentral, which have provided me with sense filters of all sorts, plus frequency simulators, pattern scopes, special gravity inducers, and a mini-comp that takes up more than half of my very tight little island of Earth pasted onto the surface of Loire, and which can do more thinking and analyzing in 2 seconds than I can do in 50 years, even good years of which I haven't had any lately. During my 4 years on Loire, I got to know several of the Luara, yet even at the end of my stay, I was still never sure just who I was talking with at any time. I could run through about 17 or 18 tests, linking the sense filters with the mini-comp and get a definite answer that way. But the Luara are a bit short on patience, and by the time I'd get done with all that, whoever it was would usually be off bouncing and sparking into the hellish vapors they call air. So usually I just conducted my researches or negotiations or idle queries, whichever they were that day, with whoever would pay attention to my anti-grav eyes, and I discovered that it didn't matter much just who I was talking with. None of them made any more sense than the others. They were all, as far as I was and am concerned, totally crazy, incomprehensible, stupid, silly, and plain damn no good. If that sounds like I'm bitter, it's because I am. I've got 42 reasons to be bitter. 42 murdered men. But back to the unfolding of the greatest legend of an ancient and venerable alien race. When the oldest had told them what they wanted to know, the three came alive with popping and flashing and dancing in the air, purr just as much as the others. It was all that they had hoped for, and more. It was the entire answer to their quest and their problems. It would enable them to create, to transcend any negative cycle climax they could have devised. After a time, the three came to themselves and remembered the rituals. "We offer thanks in the name of Miniaro, whose suicide we are avenging," Fles said gravely, waving his message in respectful, deep blue spirals. "We thank you in our own names as well," said Asteria. "And we thank you in the name of no one and nothing," said Purr, "for that is the greatest thanks conceivable." But the oldest merely sat there, pulsing his dull red, and the three wondered among themselves. At last the oldest said, "To accept thanks is to accept responsibility, and in only today as I am, there can be none of that because there can be no new act. I am outside time, you know, which is almost outside life. All this which I have told you is something told to you before, many times, and it will be again." Nonetheless, the three went through all the rituals of Thanksgiving, performing them with flawless grace and care, the color and sound demonstrations, the dances, the offerings of their own energy, and all the rest. And Purr said, "It is possible to give thanks for a long-past act, or even a mindless reflex, and we do so in the highest." The oldest pulsed dull red and did not answer, and after a time the three took leave of him. Armed with the knowledge he had given them, they had no trouble penetrating the barrier protecting Rock, the oldest's personality home, and in moments were once again alone with themselves in the raging storm that encircled the vortex. For long minutes they hung in midair, whirling and darting in their most tightly linked patterns, while the storm whipped them and the vortex pulled them. Then, abruptly, they broke their patterns and hurled themselves deliberately into the heart of the vortex itself. In a moment, they had disappeared. They seemed to feel neither motion nor lapse of time as they fell into the vortex. It was a change that came without perception or thought, a change from self to unself, from existence to void. They knew only that they had given themselves up to the vortex, that they were suddenly lost in darkness and a sense of surrounding emptiness which had no dimension. They knew without thinking that if they could have sent forth sound, there would have been no echo, that a spark or even a bright flare would have brought no reflection from anywhere, for this was the place of the origin of life, and it was empty. It was up to them to fill it, if it was to be filled. So they used the secret which the oldest had given them, the secret which those at the beginning had discovered by accident, and which only one of the oldest could have remembered. Having set themselves for this before entering the vortex, they played their individual parts automatically, the selfless, unconscious, almost random acts which even non-living energy can perform. And when all parts had been completed precisely, correctly, and at just the right time and in just the right sequence, the creating took place. It was a food beast. It formed and took shape before them in the void, and grew and glowed its dull, drab glow until it was whole. For a moment it drifted there, then suddenly it was expelled from the vortex, thrown out violently as though from an explosion, away from the nothingness within, away from darkness and silence, into the crashing, whipping violence of the storm outside. And with it went the three, vomited forth with the primitive bit of life they had made. Outside, in the storm, the three went automatically into their tightest motion sequence, whirling and blinking around each other in desperate striving to maintain themselves amid the savagery that roiled around them. And once again they felt the powerful pull of the vortex behind them, gripping them anew now that they were outside. And they knew that the vortex would draw them in again, this time forever, unless they were able to resist it. But they found that they were nearly spent, They had lost more of themselves in the vortex than they had ever imagined possible. They hardly felt alive now, and somehow they stand the crushing powers of both the storm and the vortex, and had to forge such a strongly interlinked motion pattern they would be able to make their way out of this place, back to calm and safety. And there was only one way they could restore themselves enough for that. Moving almost as one, they converged upon the mindless food beast they had just created, and they ate it. That's not precisely the end of the dance of the Changer and the Three. It does go on for a while, telling of the honors given the three when they returned, and of Miniaro's reaction when he completed his change by reappearing around the life moat left by a dying windbird, and of how all of the three turned away from their honors and made their next changes almost immediately. But my own attention never quite follows the rest of it. I always get stuck at that one point in the story, that supremely contradictory moment when the three destroyed what they had made, when they came away with no more than they had brought with them. It doesn't even achieve irony, and yet it is the emotional high point of the dance as far as the Luara are concerned. In fact, it's the whole point of the dance, as they've told me with brighter sparkings and flashes than they ever use when talking about anything else. And if the three had been able to come away from there without eating their food beast, then their achievement would have been duly noted, applauded, giggled at by the newly changed, and forgotten within 2 life cycles. And these are the creatures with whom I had to deal and whose rights I was charged to protect. I was ambassador to a planet full of things that would tell me with a straight face that 2 and 2 are orange. And yes, that's why I'm back on Earth now, and why the rest of the expedition, those who are left alive from it, are back here too. If you could read the 15 microtape report I filed with Unicentral, which you can't, by the way, Unicentral always classifies its failures, it wouldn't tell you anything more about the Luara than I've just told you in the story of the dance. In fact, it might tell you less, because although the report contained masses of hard data on the Luara, plus every theory I could come up with or coax out of the mini-comp, I didn't have much about the dance. And it's only in things like that, attitude data rather than IQ indices, psych reports and so on, that you can really get the full impact of what we were dealing with on Loire. After we'd been on the planet for 4 standard years, after we'd established contact and exchanged gifts and favors and information with the Luara, after we'd set up our entire mining operation and had had it running without hindrance for over 3 years, after all that, the raid came. One day a sheet of dull purple light swept in from the horizon, and as it got closer I could see that it was a whole colony of the Luara, their individual colors and fluctuations blending into that single purple mass. I was in the mountain, not outside with the mining extensors, so I saw all of it, and I lived through it. They flashed in over us like locusts descending, and they hit the crawlers and dredges first. The metal glowed red, then white, then it melted. Then it was just gas that formed billowing clouds rising to the sky. Somewhere inside those clouds was what was left of the elements which had comprised 17 human beings, who were also vapor now. I hit the alarm and called everyone in, but only a few made it. The rest were caught in the tunnels when the Luara swarmed over them. They went up in smoke too. Then the automatic locks shut, and the mountain was sealed off, and 6 of us sat there watching on the screen as the Luara swept back and forth outside, cleaning up the bits and pieces they'd missed. I sent out 3 of my eyes, but they too were promptly vaporized. Then we waited for them to hit the mountain itself. 6 frightened men huddled in the comp room, none of us saying anything, just sweating. But they didn't come. They swarmed together in a tight spiral, went 3 times around the mountain, made one final salute dip, and then whirled straight up and out of sight. Only a handful of them were left behind out there. After a while, I sent out a 4th eye. One of the Luara came over, flitted around it like a firefly, blinked through the spectrum, and settled down to hover in front for talking. It was Purr. A Purr who was 1,000 million billion life cycles removed from the Purr we know and love, of course, but nonetheless, still pretty much Purr. I sent out a sequence of lights and movements that translated roughly as, "What the hell did you do that for?" And Purr glowed pale yellow for several seconds, then gave me an answer that doesn't translate. Or if it does, the translation is just, "Because." Then I asked the question again, in different terms, and she gave me the same answer in different terms. I asked a 3rd time and a 4th, and she came back with the same thing. She seemed to be enjoying the variations on the dance. Maybe she thought we were playing. Well, we'd already sent out our distress call by then, so all we could do was wait for a relief ship and hope they wouldn't attack again before the ship came, because we didn't have a chance of fighting them. We were miners, not a military expedition. God knows what any military expedition could have done against energy things anyway. While we were waiting, I kept sending out the eyes, and I kept talking to one Luara after another. It took 3 weeks for the ship to get there, and I must have talked to over 100 of them in that time, and the sum total of what I was told was this. Their reason for wiping out the mining operation was untranslatable. No, they weren't mad. No, they didn't want us to go away. Yes, we were welcome to the stuff we were taking out of the depths of the Luaran Ocean. And most importantly, no, they couldn't tell me whether or not they were likely ever to repeat their attack. So we went away, limped back to Earth, and we all made our reports to Eunice Central. We included, as I said, every bit of data we could think of, including an estimate of the value of the new elements on Loire, which was something on the order of 50 times the wealth of Earth system, with royalties from Orion thrown in for Lanyap, and we put it up to Unicentral as to whether or not we should go back. Unicentral has been humming and clicking for 10 months now, but it hasn't made a decision.